Hey there, guys. So I want to discuss with you today a little bit about really overcoming mental health and really, or becoming stronger, I should say, through understanding, your mental health, as well as how it relates to, being LGBT and really understanding the importance of really getting a grasp of your identity and who you are. The reason I think this is important to talk about is because this is something that I've went through a lot myself. I went through a lot of different moments, and I've sort of teased a few of those moments where I've mentioned I was hospitalized before in the past. And the reason why I think these things are important is because I think we don't really emphasize the importance of how much our mental health really impacts us in the longer term. We don't think about, how we sort of hold on to those things, and especially when it comes to our own identity and that we lock them up. So the reason, again, is that we have to face the reality of things. So, like I mentioned, I went through many different, obstacles when it comes to really overcoming the struggles that I've had mentally and, dealing with anxiety and depression. So I want to touch a little bit on my story. Now, again, I'm not a psychiatrist or any, I'm not any mental health professional at all, but what I want to, sort of share is my story and my sort of opinion and, my perspective on what I've went through. So whenever, I started to really figure out my identity and figure out, sort of who I am. One of the things that, I really struggled with, and I think it really had an effect on me, was, a lot of my faith and really trying to reconcile that. And I think, the just the aspect of trying to be the right person and trying to do the right things while struggling with your own identity is very difficult, and I think it plays a toll. It plays a big toll on, really, trying to be, who, trying to be the right person for your family, for your, everyone around you, because you want to sort of be, representative of who they, the ideal person, the perfect person. And that's kind of, you know, what you want to be when it comes to, if you've grown up into a particular faith and, you want to be, what that ideal person for your family. It's hard, and I went through that a lot. And I think, all of the experiences that I went through in church, again, a lot of that adds up. A lot of the things that are said to you adds up. And that's like I mentioned too, where, I went through bullying when I was in high school and, well, in particular, middle school. And so a lot of times we don't realize how much, all of that we're holding in sort of makes an impact on, how, as we, get older and as we go through life, we don't realize that that stuff, it stays inside. And the more that we let it stay inside, the more that it becomes an issue down the road and that it becomes really, something that is going to, hold us back into really revealing every part of our life. One thing, like I mentioned, I was hospitalized for a period of time, and this was back in my early 20s. Whenever I was working at a photography place at the time, and again when I was in school, I went to art school for a period of time, and I studied digital photography, which I mentioned a little bit in my coming out video. But there was a sort of photography place that I was working at the time, and it was mainly like family portraits and things like that. And it was a very stressful environment. It was not an easy place to work at when you had, a bunch of different families coming in, and especially during the holidays, and it just got kind of chaotic. And I had one day where I was going into work and I was sort of being trained at the time. And I was just really, I was so out of it. I was just fearing going in there and, doing it. And I was just like, again, I was dealing with outside of work, understanding myself, and then going into work and starting this new thing. It was like so many different things kind of colliding at once. And so I just remember having my head down and I was just really just panicking. And I knew that you know, uh, before I had actually had this moment, I was dealing with a lot of really bad thoughts, of, self harm and things of that nature. And again, I'm fine now, but I was dealing with a lot of those different thoughts at the time. And so there was, of course, that time where I had a panic attack at work. And what I did was I just told them, I'm having these thoughts. I'm having all of this, going on in my head. And I just remember they put me in an ambulance and they took me, somewhere like, it was like sort of a hospital that was for, people dealing with, mental health issues. And I just remember that feeling of just being like just in a really uncomfortable environment. And, it was just, it was so outside of what I was used to. I'd never had anything like that happen. But I knew that, I'd always heard that if you tell them that you're having these thoughts, that they're going to, hospitalize you. And at the time I was like, wondering if I should do this or if this is the wrong thing to do. But I knew that I had to face it. I had to go in there and I had to go into this uncomfortable, sort of position to really find myself and figure out, how to overcome this struggle, in within myself. And I just remember when I went to, you know, this hospital, and I just remember there was a lot of different people who had similar, sort of, situations. They were kind of struggling with dealing with different things happening in life, and we all kind of had, of course, we all had different situations, but we were very similar in a lot of different aspects. And again, I'm keeping things as, vague as possible. Do not, I don't want to say any names or anything like that or where this was at. Um, but what I do want to say again is that when I was here, I just remember that they were very strict on what we could do, and we had to communicate with the people around us. It was constantly, we had to be kind of really face all of this, this feeling of being uncomfortable. We didn't have access to a phone. It was only certain times that we could use the phone and call, somebody, and it was a very strict environment. And we would have times where we would be in groups together, and we would sort of talk about different things. We would, take time to really discuss, kind of what we're going through and all the different, sort of situations to be able to really get that, get all of what's in our head out. And that was like the big thing that it was hard. It was hard for me. It was one of the hardest things when I went through this experience. Um, but I think, again, when I look back on it in retrospect, I think it was one of the best things that I could have done for myself. One of the things I think is really hard, and I think that we really sort of fear, is really taking the time to face what is in our head. And we, a lot of times, we bottle it up and we don't really, sort of speak it. And I think as more so if you're somebody who is LGBTQ and you're really, your identity, you don't know how people are going to react to it. You don't know what the, reaction is going to be. And that's just like whenever I had, my, first time sort of coming out, how it was very difficult. Again, I don't want to rehash that because I discussed it, but you don't know. It's that fear in your mind where you're wondering, how is this going to come off to other people, and especially your family. And, that's something that I think it's more so, when we're talking about mental health, it's more so with people who are, different. It's just more so that way because we present ourselves in a different way. We think about things in a different way that's, not the same as, somebody who, maybe more of a, quote unquote normal person, but there's no really such thing as a normal, there's no such thing as that. But when you're somebody who is different, it's, you don't know how people react. And like I've said, when somebody who, like when you're gay and you have people that'll, call you out on the street. I remember even when I was like, outside of school, and when I got older and I was, sort of getting out there. I remember, going to different places. And I remember being called out on the street, just being called, gay or fag. I remember that too. Like, and a lot of, we don't really think about the impact of words and how words really stick with us, but they do. They stick with us hard. And, I just, again, going back to being in hospital, you had to face these things. And I remember getting to the end. Again, I was in the hospital for 7 days. I remember getting to the end, getting ready to, go back home. And I remember that my sexuality was the biggest thing that I was really trying to reconcile, because I had so much struggles with acceptance from family. And so I just remember at that time when they were telling me, okay, we're getting ready to basically discharge you and send you home. And there was like this last meeting that I had with one of the doctors that was there. And she was really telling me that you have to, really kind of come to terms with this. You have to face this. You can't just let it be, you have to face it. And I just remember that. I remember, how, again, it was hard. I just remember being so emotional because I connected with a lot of people there. It was nice in a sense to where I was able to talk to people who had situations where they were going through in life, and they, being able to talk to them and understand sort of what they were going through really helped me in a lot of ways. But outside of that, I had many times where I had to go to therapy. Even then, after this situation, when I was in LA, I lived in Los Angeles, as I mentioned before. When I was in LA for at least 3 years, I went to the LGBT center up there, and I remember going to therapy many times. Struggling with, I just kept thinking about my family, and I kept thinking about, you know, again, I've always been somebody who's a pleaser, and be somebody who, you know, kind of fits, kind of being cookie cutter and try to fit in. I kind of tried to be that person, but in a sense, I'm not that person, because I just, the way that I see things and, understand things is so different than, a lot of people. And I knew that when I was younger. And, I just remember I had to go to therapy multiple times there. And I always mentioned, about my family. And I mentioned, really, again, I just, there was a lot of, sort of self hatred I had with myself. And I had to, of course, get on medication. There was a long period of time where I was trying to figure out what type of medication I had to have, and just sort of understanding, you know, because I didn't want to do that. I'd had times where I had to actually call, you know, a suicide hotline at one time, where I was just really struggling. And I just remember all those different moments. I had my roommate. He was trying to console me when I was, really just going through a time of panic, and whenever I had moved back to Tennessee, I had to go back into therapy. It was really bad when I came back to Tennessee, because I was used to that environment. And then, I go back into a small town, and it's like I'm trying to get reacclimated into this environment again. And I had to, go to therapy, when I was here in Tennessee, or, for a period of time. I'm better now. I finally got my medication sort of where it needs to be, where I'm sort of, level headed, in other words. But I had times where I went to therapy, and my sexuality was just one thing. I tried to avoid talking about it, because at the time I was, quote unquote, trying to change. It's not something that you can change. It is what it is. You are who you are, and it's not something that you can alter. And I just, so many times I tried to avoid talking about it, and they were trying to get me to. I know they were trying to get me to pull it out and sort of really, dive into it, but I always avoided it, because I just, I didn't want to talk about it, because I just the fear of talking about it and facing it. It was a big thing. And so overall, sort of going over this topic, the reason why, I'm going over this is because when you don't face, those things that you're suppressing, they are going to come back, and it's going to be so much harder if you continue to hold in those things. You need to talk about them. You need to, release that and talk to people about what you're facing. The more that you can, be willing to be vulnerable, the more it is going to help you in the long run. So if you're somebody who's dealing with any of the issues, like with mental health and even with your sexuality, please, take the time to talk to somebody. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a mental health professional at all, but what I'm trying to do is give, a little bit of my sort of experience and my insight on what I've went through. And I really hope that this is something that you can kind of think about and really ponder. And, again, reach out when you need help. There's so many people out there. I've had so many friends that have been there for me through so many situations, and they, have consoled me. They've, given me so much support. And what I'm trying to say is reach out to somebody you really trust and that is going to really listen and understand where you're coming from. They may not fully understand, your whole situation because everybody's life is different, but they can help you in a lot of ways, if it's somebody that you really trust. So thank you guys for watching. I want to continue to share these types of videos. I really enjoy going over this because I think it's so important to talk about these things because they don't get talked about. And especially in this day and age now, it's very hard for a lot of people, especially when you're somebody who's LGBTQ. So thank you guys once again, and I will see you guys in the next one.